any good workshop, you need to consider who the audience is, why are they attending, why are they coming to this workshop, why are they here, and the last thing is how much time are they spending with you. And when you think about it in those three frames, you can pretty much cover every aspect of like what's needed to run a successful workshop for all the participants who are involved, like both the facilitators and the attendees.
Yeah, let's get into it, man. You've run a lot of workshops over the course of your career, and through the discussions we've had, I find that like you have a lot of particularities about workshops in general that I haven't noticed with other people. And because we run so many workshops, we're always discussing things around them. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to just sit and chat a little bit and figure out like what are the nuances that we think make a great workshop, because I think it's super important to us.
The way I see it, and the reason why I mention, audience, purpose, and time, is because in many workshops, you can almost feel when there's a purpose, but they didn't know who they were talking to.
Totally.
Or there was a lot of good intention. They fully understood the audience. The topics were great, but you were always rushing and you never felt like you had enough time to process anything. And the last thing is some workshops, they run really well. It was for the right audience, but it just didn't seem to like have any strong landing. Like, okay, I learned this thing, but I don't know what to do with it. You know what I mean? Like, sure. It's like not time well spent,
Yeah, I mean, we've all been to workshops where it felt like at the end of it was like, okay, cool. Yeah. I kind of had fun, but I'm not sure exactly what I took away from the workshop.
Yeah, exactly.
A really cool workshop is one that you feel like your time is well served, so you're there, feels like this is the best thing I could be doing with my time. You feel like it's directly targeted at you. And also, honestly, you feel kind of like ideally inspired or excited.
Energized is one that I like to go for always.
Totally. If you go in with more energy, if you leave with more energy than you came out with, I mean, that's an amazing workshop.
That's awesome.
So do you want to kind of help us break down at least the first category here?
So we're going to start with the audience.
Cool.
I think that's always a good place to start because they ultimately dictate everything that you do.
It's a show, man.
It's a show.
I think that's like an important thing is it's a performance and it's an audience. One thing, it's just a little sidebar here that I think is interesting. I remember one workshop we ran like last year where after the workshop, we decided to go get lunch with a bunch of participants. We sat down and we're having all these conversations, and one of the key things that came up at one point was like, how many of you have done improv? Because you were talking about your improv classes, and literally out of 6 people, 5 people raised their hands. I'm like, they're not the funniest people. And I to me it was like, okay, wow, these people are curious about performance so much, and like they're all people who do speaking stuff and have done a lot of workshops. And I thought it was so interesting that like these people who I think run good workshops are also people who've done improv.
I would also add that, the reason why we're starting with the audience, in addition to it being like a performance, if you think about it like a journey, you need to know where someone's coming from to know where you can take them. Without that knowledge, what are you building on?
Yeah.
It's like going to build a building and not knowing what kind of floor there is. Is it sand?
Totally.
Are you building on mud, swamp ground, rock? And that changes the kind of building that you can build. And it's the same thing with people. So we start with people. And under that, there are 2 things that we like to cover.
Yeah.
It's why should they trust you? And what do they already know?
So to dive into the first one, oftentimes when we run the workshop, we're just excited about the content of the workshop. So we'll jump directly into the workshop. But one of the things we realize is like these people are here, we're speaking with these people, but we haven't really introduced ourselves. We've done like a quick intro of like, oh, hey, I'm Alan. We run a studio. Let's dive into this stuff. But like, okay, well, why are we positioned to actually convey any knowledge at all? Like we could just be whoever and be trying to kind of, posture up there. So I think it's really important that when you're going to be taking an audience on a journey, they feel that you're actually a person who has the knowledge and can take them on that journey. So, there's a way to introduce yourself, and I think it's actually in that book.
You haven't referred to.
Yeah. So, maybe we can bring up the book if you want to just kind of quickly introduce it.
Yeah. So this book is called How to Design and Teach Workshops That Work Every Time by Rob Fitzpatrick and Devin Hunt.
Yeah.
It is honestly a really, really good survival guide, as the thing calls itself, or like maybe a hand guide. We are not sponsored by these people.
No.
We make no money for recommending this. But as far as books go, you can see not too thick, super to the point, and very actionable insights across the board on like everything that you need to know to run a really good interactive workshop.
Totally.
If you want to lecture, not the book for you. But if you want to engage the audience in this really sick way, this book is very much one that we use all the time.
I think they even have a chapter called How to Introduce Yourself Without Sounding Like a Total Idiot.
Yeah. How to introduce yourself without making everyone hate you. That's really good wording.
So, yeah, I mean, but basically the point is you have to introduce yourself, introduce that you have a skill set that they can actually learn from, show that you have experience, and then also just command attention in such a way where they feel like they're going to be taken care of throughout the journey. So one thing that me and Charlie do when we're giving workshops is we'll actually just like take one of our case studies and we'll go through it. We'll try and find like the most interesting one, obviously, and show that as a way of kind of positioning our experience, as well as kind of naming some of the people we've worked with, just to show legitimacy. And that typically, helps, and it makes the workshop run a lot smoother,
Can I add that when we have run them in the past, originally, I think both of us don't like the idea of looking, I don't know, we have a hard time selling our experience. Right? And I think many people genuinely have that struggle.
Yeah.
I think many people who lean on the creative side tend to have some discomfort with like, I am so good at my job. But I remember one very specific workshop. I think this one I was invited to speak alone. And I went through the whole thing with all these lessons and why you should do this and why you shouldn't do that. And then we get to the I get to the end, and the instructor who had invited me was like, cool, thank you so much. I don't have any questions. And someone during the Q&A looks and they're like, what do you do? Like, what's your experience?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, well, I started walking through it a little bit and have a studio. We do this. And they were like, oh, thank you. Yeah, like, you should share that next time. It's really interesting. And like, it gave a lot of context to all the lessons that you were giving. And that was, I think, the first time I realized that, just like this book said, there's a way to do it without getting people to hate you.
Yeah.
But also, you're not doing it to be like, I'm the best.
Yeah.
You're doing it so that people have context.
Yeah.
Like, wait, why are you, what do you mean?
Totally.
Oh, there's a reason why you're telling me this. Okay, I see. Oh, because you did this before and it didn't work. Or I see that you've worked with clients that I find interesting. So I'm going to listen to what you're saying because I want to, do what you're doing.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that was a really big one. And it was cool to learn it on the fly. That question came to me like years after I started workshopping. For years, I used to just go and like not say what I did, So that's trust. And then the second one is what do they already know? This one is tricky because you can't actually know what they already know, right? Like, obviously, you can't get into their minds. You can send out a pre-survey, but half, if not more, will just never answer it.
Totally.
Or at least answer it in a way that's like super productive. Sometimes you can ask people to like put their company or their job title when they sign up to a workshop, so you can see, okay, I see it's many accountants and not many designers, and this is a design thinking workshop, so let me maybe change what I say. But ultimately, the goal of what do they already know is for us to be able to measure whether or not the learning objectives that we were going to set in the next thing, which is why are they here, are able to be achieved. Like, if somebody invites us to give a workshop on building prototypes in Figma, but not a single person there has ever opened Figma, imagine we don't know that when we walk in.
Totally.
It's like, okay, guys, open up Figma. And they're like, what?
Yeah. I mean, this type of information, typically, like, ideally, you're collaborating with someone. Oftentimes, when we're running workshops, we're working with like an organization, and they'll give us information about the audience. But it's all based in assumptions. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes it just has to do with what level of knowledge, right? Like in design, what level of knowledge. We ran a workshop for people who work in industrial design, for example. And we kind of shifted around like, oh, we're going to talk about, prototyping and stuff like that. But it doesn't really make sense in this context. Let's talk about interviewing, because industrial designers do conduct interviews. And we kind of, shifted the workshop to fit around that particular audience.
Mm-hmm. So that's who they are. Or who are they? What's the next thing?
Next is, why are they here? And that's broken into two key questions that we have here, which is, what do we want them to think? And what do we want them to do?
The reason why we split think and do, because I know any educators watching this is like, you can think while doing. 100%.
I can't.
But the difference, I think, is in one of them, it's kind of like, what do we want them to like physically do, and maybe what are the artifacts that they're going to create and maybe even take away. Versus think is that metacognitive part, like what am I thinking about? And so we'll start with that, because thinking can be, let's say you're giving a pottery workshop, right? And you've decided that the audience, where we start, is people who have never touched pottery before. So on the thinking side, you were talking about giving them confidence, maybe giving them the overall, mental model of what it means to shape clay on a wheel, right? You can give a very not practical how to work with clay workshop that's purely about reflection and thinking, and here's ways you can get started, but there's like zero doing in this.
Like getting super comfortable, getting your hands dirty.
Yeah, exactly. And there may not be a doing component in there. If it's a 30-minute sort of like lunch and learn thing where you're just bringing in a pottery expert who is going to give a very simple like overview, you might not have time to shape clay on the table, So then we have to ask ourselves, like, what are the thoughts, what are the reflections that we want them to take away? Like you said, maybe it's just about boosting their confidence. Maybe it's about inspiration. Maybe it's about helping someone move from more junior thinking to more, mid-level or senior thinking. And so when under think, it's all the cognition related stuff. Honestly, it's relatively simple when you say it, but I think nailing those is always hard. Like actually writing down your objectives, it's always such a challenge. And having worked with instructional designers and even on our own workshops, our own course, there's always this struggle of, but what exactly are we trying to get them to think about?
I think the framing is super important. The reason we say, what do we want them to think versus what is our mission? Like what is our mission as workshop givers, is we want it to be focused on their experience. And whenever we approach the workshop, like we really are thinking from their experience, how are they experiencing the workshop, not what are we trying to accomplish. So I just think that's important, that if you're going to be running a workshop, that's why you can ask yourself, what do you want them to think?
Yeah, I that's actually a good point. Across the board, all our questions today are going to be them, the audience, like the who. It's something that we, I guess, carry from our UX training. It's something that most instructional designers think about. It's always about the person that's in the room.
Totally.
So that's the thinking.
The second part of why are they here is what do we want them to do? So what do we want them to do is really kind of based in structure. So different types of activities that we want them to try out. Practice, exactly. So what is the applied version of what we're trying to get them to think? So an example would be like, okay, let's say we want them to understand that interviews are super important for changing your perspective. What do we need to do in order to accomplish that? One thing we do, we have a workshop about interviews, is we actually have them interview 3 different people in a very short amount of time to show, okay, the amount of variety that comes from these conversations and how much each time you conduct the interview, you get richer and richer information depending on how you change the questions. Like we obviously have a little bit of tweaking in between interviews, and that way they think, oh wow, interviews are super rich, and the doing is we've done 3 interviews.
It's a cycle.
Totally.
Think and do, they are working together. And for each thing that you want to think, if possible, it would be great to have a do opportunity. It's not always possible.
I want to bring up also, there's a great website that we've used before. Is it called Mindstorm? Come on.
Gamestorming.
Gamestorming. Okay, so gamestorming, what's great about gamestorming is it's kind of pairs those things. So it'll show activities and what those activities are great for accomplishing. If you haven't heard of gamestorming, for sure, we'll link it somewhere, and you should definitely check it out if you're conducting workshops. It's the best.
Yeah, we'll put the link in the description. I'll also put it up on the screen just so people can see. It's really great. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing that we didn't really cover, because this isn't what this chat is about, is like, how do you actually structure the instructions? But gamestorming has really good structure. They have very clear objectives for every workshop. They have very clear steps.
Yeah.
And they almost have like a how to run it if you're a dummy.
Totally.
Like you just follow the instructions and you run a pretty sick workshop. And that's actually, to go back to this book, that's actually one thing that he says in the book. One of the premises in here is, if the instructions are laid out with sufficient detail for the facilitator, even someone who is not comfortable in front of an audience can run a pretty good workshop.
Totally.
And you know that design thinking one that we give?
Yes.
That we took from Stanford? I mean,
the wallet challenge.
The wallet challenge? That's one of those things where they even tell you what quips to make. Yeah. Like, you're basically an automaton. You're just there like, wow, wasn't that interesting?
Laugh here.
Yeah. But if you think about it, we're comfortable giving workshops, and yet following that guide for the wallet challenge, we get such reliable like output from doing that.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's clear that, yeah, we're comfortable, sure, but you can give that thing to just about anyone, and I'm sure they'd get about 80% of the way there.
Yeah, 100%.
And then the last thing, how long are they staying? You know, what time do you guys have together?
Yeah.
And this one is the underlying structure of the whole thing, because fundamentally, having 1 hour with someone versus a whole day or 3 hours in each one of those things,
yeah,
it completely changes the depths of what you can achieve. It completely changes what you're even expected to establish with these people. Like a 1 hour lunch and learn, we're not really going to become friends with the people attending. A whole day workshop, you know, now we're talking like deeper relationship building. So many things change based on the time. And it's almost like, you were saying this before we started recording, you were using the word filter. Like, it's almost a way to like filter out, do we do this, do we not do that? Absolutely. You know what I mean? I guess all of them are filters.
Sure.
But time is this, it's the most concrete filter.
100%.
Ultimately, 10 minutes is 10 minutes. Like,
exactly.
You know.
And it really dictates like what we choose to do and not do.
Yeah.
You know, if we have like a mission and we, you know, have not a lot of time, like, can we even accomplish that mission? Do we have to change the nature of the workshop? Like, time is the ultimate kind of, you know, cut off, basically.
Yeah, because if you combine the other two things, like, okay, I know that they don't know anything about interviewing. I know that they're here to learn the specifics of a really, you know, good 1 hour interview.
Yeah.
But it's a 1 hour workshop. I mean, how many interviews can they conduct in the workshop? Not much.
No, exactly.
You know? How many lessons can we drive home?
Yeah.
You know, to have it sink in? Because you also don't want to give people like 100 item list.
No.
So,
I mean, yeah, you have a moment of capturing attention, and like, that's it. I mean, speaking of attention, the first question we have is, how is their energy being changed? So I think, you know, time and energy are very much kind of on a graph here when you look at any workshop. And I think one thing that's really interesting that you can try on your own is actually like put your workshop on a chart and straight up like put the different pieces there, and then put, you know, one line that says energy and another line that says time, like this, and actually map out like what you think the energy versus time would be. And I think it can give you a really good idea of like, okay, is this actually like an engaging workshop? Because energy inherently, it's a thing that starts to go like, it starts low. Typically, or I mean, maybe, I don't know, mid. Yeah, exactly. But you know, people are there and like, they're like, okay, you have to kind of capture our attention and our energy. Otherwise it'll start to dwindle. I mean, we've all been in that context where we've gone to a lecture on like something that seems like it'd be interesting, but so much of the lecture is just information density being pushed into our faces. And like, okay, well, the energy versus time situation here is not balanced in a way to create engagement. You know, there's different mediums for different things, but I think it is important for me because like I won't absorb the information as well, because I'm kind of being forced to sit through 3 hours of just trying to absorb something without any form of engagement. And that could be even on their storytelling abilities or whatever, but I think that's super important. So think about your energy and think about it per activity. Think about it per time frame. Like typically the way we run workshops is like, we'll break things out and like, okay, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. Think about the energy within each one of those and if it's going up or down, and it can dictate the order of activities, you know? Like, okay, do we want to conduct interview after interview after interview, or do we want to conduct an interview, get some energy going, then have a conversation, which is a little bit more low key, low stakes, and then we could just have an open dialogue and then jump back into interviews and bring up the energy again. You know, you have to kind of think of it like time is the medium of someone who loves to like run workshops. And you have to kind of treat it as like a kind of energy time fluctuation thing.
The charts, I love me at 2 axes. I think I'm addicted to them. Yes. Anytime I have a moment, I'm like, this is a matrix. Or there's 2 axes that we can think along. But honestly, like, we're using the word energy here to mean, you know, literally how much life is in these people, right? Like people
Totally.
get tired. That it's a biological constant. Like like you were saying, there's nothing wrong with a dense lecture, but maybe a dense lecture is good in like a 20 to 30 minute burst with lots of small breaks for people to process.
Totally.
You know, unlike just 3 hours of straight lecture, like most people cannot stomach that in a way that is productive. And then even in chunks, like we think so much in blocks that we
You gonna talk about Flota?
we tried to make an app that is in the world's longest alpha, where we could, you know, assemble the blocks and make it easier to bounce things around on there. I'll link to one of the videos that we recorded about that. And the idea of putting the blocks there really puts things in perspective, because if you see that you have this very short intro, then a break, and then the super long stretch of time, then a break, and then it ends really suddenly. Imagine a movie like that.
Totally.
Imagine sitting in a theater at a show where the climax happens like 6 seconds before the end, and then it's over. But the whole thing was a slog, you know?
Yeah.
Similarly, imagine like kicking off with the world's most incredible like action sequence in a film,
Yeah.
and then the rest of it's like a conversation between two people in a cafe. Totally untalented actors just saying nothing to each other.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, what just happened?
Totally.
And I don't think this is unique. When you opened with like, it's a show, it's a performance, time and performance go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So yeah, and we have control over the energy.
One thing, just like, as you know, what are the instruments of energy control? I think just to kind of clearly go through them, you know, I'm going to list them just off the top of my brain, like music, breaks, engagement, peer-to-peer communication and like learning, whatever, some kind of fun game. Like these are all things that can control energy, and music is the biggest thing. Like we have seen, like, why do I need to do work when some super talented person has already done the work of figuring out how to get people energized, and I don't even need to think about it, you know? Just play a playlist of some dope, energizing music, and guess what? People will be energized.
I'll take a lesson from, honestly, like this trick that I took from bars.
Yeah.
When bars want you to drink more and have more fun, they just crank up the music slightly. You don't even notice.
Yeah.
If you spend time in a bar between the hours of 7 p.m. to around 11 p.m., you're there for 5 hours, you actually don't notice it, but the music is constantly getting louder.
Yeah.
And so same thing here. If we feel the conversations are dying, let's jack up the music a little bit, slightly.
Yeah.
They're not going to hear it, but suddenly it's a bit harder to talk, so they talk a bit louder and you bring up that energy. Very good to do at the last 30 seconds of like a group brainstorming thing that's going on. And we're really harping on time, but in this book, he has a point that says, vary the teaching formats to improve energy, attention, and learning. And so that's exactly what you were saying, right? You mentioned peer learning, you mentioned lecture, you mentioned conversation, debrief. Each one of those has a different energy level, and switching between them back and forth is the easiest way to keep the energy at a nice up and down.
Totally.
Which brings us to, honestly, I think a pretty quick point.
Yeah.
Which is what can they realistically accomplish in that time? This one is honestly about just good time management.
Yeah.
If energy is about like their mood, this one's more about like whether or not you're setting them up for success. So ultimately, if you're giving a workshop on interviewing and you want people to feel the impact of it, but you make the interview 2 minutes long, they're not gonna get into the meat of the interview.
Yeah.
They're gonna maybe introduce themselves, ask 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah, what you're trying to make them think there is, I'm anxious.
Exactly. So I think this one's really about like not just over the course of a 3-hour workshop what can be realistically done, but in each independent block, make sure that those are very realistic expectations. So don't set yourself up for a 5-minute lecture when you really intend to give a 10-minute lecture, because the subject matter is so complex. You're either going to have to speak really fast, which they're not going to understand, the audience is not going to understand, or you're going to have to cut something else because you poorly manage your time as an instructor. And from the audience's perspective, if you give them 5 minutes to like practice something in Figma or some tool that they've never used before, where it might take them out of the 5 minutes a full 3 minutes to even orient themselves, they're not going to feel good.
Yeah.
They're just going to feel like failures.
Yeah.
And everyone's going to be upset.
I think so. The one thing I would add to that is what can they realistically accomplish? The realistically accomplish, that's the subjective bit, right? That's for you as like the workshop host to figure out. But the one thing that we've learned over time is like, okay, if we want them to try and learn something, we're going to have like a check-in, check-out moment on either side of something, for example, to make sure, okay, we hear that you've learned something. Are they absorbing the information? Are we checking in at the right moment to know that they're absorbing the information? And also that, like, be focused, you can't get a lot done in 2 hours. So you should think about really like, okay, how is time and the accomplishment really converging here? And we've found that generally speaking, trying to like get one message across is the best thing that you can do, rather than try to jam a bunch of stuff in, because you always have less time than you think. If you're running any workshop, any person who's done plenty knows that there's 10 minutes at the beginning that's gone, maybe even 15 if people are late, maybe even 20, and then there's like that 10 minutes at the end. So really, that's already half an hour gone. So it's just, I think that's the type of stuff that I think is important to talk about also.
It's cheesy, but like the less is more.
Yeah.
Adage, it's lame to invoke something so basic in a moment like this, but ultimately my first workshops when I first started teaching were very jam-packed.
Yeah.
Because in my head I'm like, I want to deliver maximum value, and in my head maximum value is like lots of context switching and bam bam boom, and you learn so many things. But what you said about you have to set the activity up correctly but then also debrief it, brains aren't, you don't just insert information.
Yeah.
There's processing time.
Totally.
One of my favorite illustrations is from the Chaos Pilot. They talk about the learning arches. So anything you want to teach has an arch.
Okay.
It has a takeoff,
Yeah.
a flight, and a landing. So when you think about it like that, if I'm going to teach you a new concept, how am I taking off? What are we doing? It's in flight. And then how are we landing it?
Totally.
Imagine a flight with no landing.
Yeah. I don't want to. That sounds
I don't want to either.
very scary.
I already don't love the idea of being in a flight. But it's exactly that. So what looks like we'll have them practice interviews for 10 minutes. Okay, but first you have to explain how.
Yeah.
Ease them into it. Then once they're done, you have to ask them, how did it go?
Yeah.
What did you learn? What was interesting? What was challenging?
Yeah.
So
I think also just to that point, I think this is an interesting thing that we've learned over time, is that like, don't underestimate people's intelligence, but don't overestimate it either. No, hear me out.
Okay.
Hear me out. One thing that people forget, like as when you're teaching someone, oftentimes people don't reflect on what it takes themselves to learn. One of the biggest things that I've noticed over time is people don't realize that repetition is a core part of learning. So when you're running a workshop, oftentimes people are like, okay, I covered that point. They learned it. Move on to the next thing. No, they have not learned it. How is it? That's crazy. Like, you're supposed to learn the guitar. Like, okay, I showed him. Here you go. Now play the instrument. That's absurd. You shouldn't expect people to understand what you're talking about without clear repetition. And that's why we talk about like one core message, because if you want to deliver just one core message, oftentimes you have to repeat it many times throughout one workshop.
And in different ways.
Yeah.
That's actually critical, because bringing things back full circle, we started with audience.
Yeah.
What do they already know? So depending on what your frame is, that thing where one friend will tell you a lesson and you're like, meh. And then someone else will tell you the exact same lesson, but in a different way.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, that's stuck. Why? It's because you have existing experiences and biases that make you more prone to listening to certain things rather than others, even though they are saying the exact same thing.
It might have just been the second time I heard it.
So it's actually it's a combination, and it's hard to like unpack exactly what happened, but that's almost the point. So that's why try different like in a workshop, have them do the same thing, but come at it from different ways. In the interviewing example, that's why we not only have people do an interview, but we have them observe interviews. Because when you observe something, you pick up on things that you won't pick up when you're doing it yourself, because you're too anxious.
Yeah.
And then we have them get interviewed. Why? Because when you're being interviewed, you're feeling what it's like to be a user, which is, again, like if you've never been a user before, you might think like, why is this user answering such a weird way? And maybe it's because it's pretty awkward to be sitting there being asked about something you don't think about every day.
Yeah.
Like when you go up to a user and you're like, oh, tell me like, why do you open up Excel and do this action in the way that you do? I don't know, man.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for 15 years.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm a bookkeeper.
Yeah. Just to kind of summarize, for those of you who conduct workshops, I think the key questions here are, who are they? And then within that, we're going to say, why should they trust you? What do they already know?
Then when we talk about purpose, why are they here? We're looking at what do we want them to think and what do we want them to do? So this is all about learning objectives, metacognition, and practice. And then the last thing is, how long are they staying? How much time are they spending with us? And for that, ultimately, it's like, how is their energy being changed, both across the workshop and within? And what can they realistically accomplish in the time of the workshop, but per activity in the workshop? And if you can answer all those questions with clarity, then you're probably on the path to having a pretty good workshop that will resonate with the people that you're trying to reach.
We love running workshops, and we love talking about, what makes a good workshop. And we honestly could probably record 10 podcasts about this subject matter. And we'd love to hear from you guys. Those of you who run workshops, what have you found to be particularly challenging, and kind of how have you unblocked yourselves? And if you like this type of content, don't forget to give us a like, subscribe to our YouTube, and see you in the next one.